Think knights really spent their days rescuing princesses and living by a noble code? Hollywood has tricked you. The real medieval knight wasn't the chivalrous hero you imagine. In fact, the rules of chivalry had nothing to do with treating women well, and everything to do with managing violent, wealthy warriors. Ready to have your fairy tale shattered one myth at a time? Let's talk about chivalry, because this is where Hollywood really pulls a fast one. You've seen it 100 times. Knights kneeling before queens, speaking in flowery poetry, and sticking to some weird code where they always help old ladies across muddy ditches. In movies, being chivalrous basically means being polite, holding doors for people, and treating everyone with perfect respect, especially women. But let's just say if you turned up in real medieval Europe expecting a knight to hand you a rose and recite Shakespeare, you'd probably get a face full of mud and a stern look instead of poetry. Here's the real kicker. The word chivalry isn't even about manners or romance. It comes from the old French word Chivalry, and that just means stuff to do with horses. Not very glamorous, is it? The original chivalric code wasn't a manual for how to be a good boyfriend. It was mostly instructions for rich men who could afford horses, armor, and very sharp swords. Think of it like the world's first how to control your violent heiress son handbook. Chivalry's entire point was about power and keeping powerful young men with too much energy and too many weapons from turning the countryside into their personal playground. So, where did all that knightly politeness even come from? Thank the church for that. Medieval Europe was basically a field full of angry, sword-happy teenagers running wild. Nobles spent more time raiding each other's land, burning villages, and stealing cows than acting like movie heroes. The church, tired of cleaning up the mess, started pushing something called the peace of God and the truce of God. If you're imagining them telling knights to be kind or gentle, think again. These rules were more like a medieval version of curfew. No murder on Sundays and, ideally, leave the peasants alone for once. Please don't slaughter your neighbors during church service is not exactly what shows up in movie scripts, but it was the kind of message that filled sermons back then. Think I'm exaggerating? Take a peek at real medieval texts, the stuff knights were supposed to learn as kids. Instead of sweet love songs, you mostly get lists of battlefield do's and don'ts. There's one classic called the Chanson de Roland, which every wannabe knight knew. It's not about holding hands or reciting poetry to your crush. It's about riding hard, fighting fiercely, and making sure you're loyal to your lord. Unless you see a good opportunity to switch sides, of course. The only role women usually got was to hand knights a piece of fabric for good luck, and then wait back home for news. If there was a damsel in distress, sure, a knight might rescue her, unless rescuing her got in the way of business. If you need more proof, try this. Just look at the rules written for the Order of the Garter, England's most famous order for knights. These rules spell out what not to do at dinner parties. No fighting with forks, no chasing people with swords through the dining hall, and a strict no murdering guests policy. Real knights didn't need lessons in politeness. They needed instructions on how not to turn every meeting into a low-budget wrestling match. Now, toss in a movie scene. You know, the kind where a knight bows low, recites poetry to a velvet-draped lady, and promises lifelong devotion. Compare that straight to the records of a tournament at Smithfield in 1390. Instead of sonnets, you get reports of knights smashing each other off their horses, and half the audience ducking to avoid flying splinters. Medieval tournaments were less about impressing women, and more about practicing your head-bashing technique. If you think the code of chivalry made real knights act like gentlemen, think again. For every story of a brave defender of the weak, there are dozens of accounts of knights looting villages, burning crops, and ransoming anyone who looked remotely rich. The church would hand out a list of don'ts, but most knights would just keep a copy under a pile of old laundry and hope to dodge trouble. In fact, most rules were for show, what the historian Georges Duby calls an ideal deliberately designed to paper over the violence. Knights might make a big deal out of their so-called honor at banquets, but on the road, it was every man for himself, and chivalry was something you quoted only when someone else was watching. Here's the real twist. Chivalry wasn't about holding doors open or writing love letters. It was about keeping sword-swinging, horse-riding, bored young men in check. The myth of the romantic knight is just a story we invented centuries later, long after the mud and the blood were washed away. So, next time someone complains about chivalry being dead, just remember, it never really lived the way Hollywood told you. But let's move on to something else Hollywood loves just as much. That brightly polished armor. Spoiler alert, wearing it wasn't as easy as movies make it look. You know that scene in movies where a knight leaps off his horse, sprints across open ground in full armor, and starts tossing people around like he's auditioning for the Olympics? Hollywood makes it look easy. Armor shines, every piece clicks together perfectly, and the hero never trips, sweats, or gets stuck halfway through a backflip. But let's take off the rose-tinted glasses for a second and talk about what it was actually like to walk around dressed head to toe in steel. Real armor was a technical wonder, but wearing it was a whole different story than you get in blockbusters. First off, the stuff was made for protection, not for looking pretty. Imagine putting on layer after layer, starting with thick, quilted cloth, because steel straight on bare skin would feel like hugging an ice-cold radiator, and then strapping on plate after plate, most of them bolted together with leather straps, buckles, and padded linings. No quick change magic here. Just getting ready could take as long as eating breakfast, and if you were in a hurry, there was a good chance you'd need help just tying everything on straight. Some pieces needed an extra set of hands, or at least a lot of patience and cursing. Now the big debate, was armor stupidly heavy or surprisingly light? You'll hear both stories, but here's what the evidence says. Full plate armor, the gold standard for knights at the height of their power, usually weighed somewhere between 44 and 55 pounds. That sounds like a lot until you hear that a US Army soldier today often hauls 66 pounds of gear. The trick was in the design. The weight wasn't just sitting on your shoulders like a giant backpack. It was spread across your body, balanced, and carefully tailored for the lucky few who could afford custom work. With the weight distributed like that, you could actually move pretty well. Knights could run, turn, swing swords, and even climb back onto a horse without a crane. Sorry, cartoons. No giant pulley systems at tournaments. All this fancy metalwork didn't come cheap. Suiting up in full plate armor was like wearing a new car everywhere you went. It cost a fortune, sometimes as much as a small piece of land or a solid year's income for a skilled worker. Only the richest knights or noble families could lay their hands on the latest armor tech, and you better believe they kept track of every dent and patch, because a full replacement cost as much as buying a second house. You weren't about to risk losing it in the mud, and you definitely didn't just toss it aside when you felt a little warm. And speaking of warmth, movies always show knights looking fresh and comfortable, usually while making dramatic speeches or flirting with a princess. In reality, these suits cooked you from the inside out, especially during summer. Historical reenactments and modern-day armor tests show a simple truth. You start off feeling invincible, but after 15 minutes, you're sweating through your underclothes, and after an hour or two, you wouldn't want to lift a finger. By the time battles really got going, even the toughest knight was dripping and desperate for a break. How about those moves? This is where Hollywood most often gets carried away. Armor wasn't just a Halloween costume. It was built with nested plates and clever joints that let you bend your arms, swing a mace, and even pick yourself up if you fell. Forget the myth that knights needed help just to stand up, or that they rolled around helplessly like metal turtles. If your armor fit properly, you could sit, kneel, lie down, and yes, get up again, all without outside help. There are even accounts and modern videos, if you've ever seen a living history group in action, of people doing somersaults or cartwheels in full plate, just to prove a point. Doesn't mean it was easy, though. Once you added an hour of sprinting or swinging a broadsword, even the fittest knight was exhausted. Armor could handle abuse, from arrows, swords, and the occasional lump of flying cow, but it had a weakness against heat, exhaustion, and cold water. The downside was the risk of overheating, especially inside a helmet. Try to imagine taking deep breaths while your head is wrapped in metal, with only a small slit to see. No one gives an Oscar-worthy speech inside a 14th century helmet, that's for sure. So, while it's true that armor allowed for movement, protection, and the chance of walking away from battle, it was never meant to turn you into a superhero. Knights weren't flying through the air or spinning around in circles like action figures. Most of the time, they moved with careful steps, dealing with the heat, the sweat, and the constant threat of falling on their faces in the middle of the mess. It was a marvel for its time, but don't mistake it for a prop. Every scratch, dent, or loose buckle told the real story. Wearing armor was hard work, and sometimes surviving just meant making it to the end of the day without passing out. Those legends of effortless athleticism, fun to watch, but not part of the reality. So, knights weren't totally helpless, but they didn't spend their days leaping buildings in a single bound, either. The true magic of armor was its engineering, and the fact that anyone would willingly wear it at all. But let's trade the metal suit for something even less glamorous now. It's time to look at the real face of battle, where all those slow-moving, sweating knights had to actually fight for their lives. You know those scenes where a single knight faces off with his sworn enemy on a stone bridge at midnight? Movies love that stuff. Close-ups on serious eyes, swords glinting in soft moonlight, a neat little duel while the whole world holds its breath. In the real medieval world, that kind of perfect showdown almost never happened. Medieval battles were messier, louder, and a whole lot more dangerous. If you were hoping for honor, fair play, or a pause for dramatic music, you picked the wrong battlefield. Let's talk about what really happened when knights went to war. Instead of one-on-one duels, you got chaos. Battles were packed, not just with knights, but also with a mix of soldiers swinging whatever weapons they had. Forget a lovely open field. Real fields turned into muddy pits with bodies everywhere. Knights fought deep in the crowd, shoulder to shoulder with dirty, sweaty men, horses screaming, banners snapping, and confusion reigning. Blades swung in every direction, sometimes hitting friend as well as foe. Shouts from commanders got lost in all the noise. Usually there was so much armor clanking and people stomping that you couldn't even hear yourself think. If you think this sounds dangerous, you're right. Plus, knights didn't care about fighting fair. The only fair play most of them thought about was with other nobles. If you were up against another knight, there might be rules about ransom or what counted as surrender. But for everyone else, peasants in the way, soldiers without family names, crossbowmen on the edges, it was a free-for-all. The chivalry myth that says knights never hit someone when they were down, that's wishful thinking. Most of the time, survival was the goal, and mercy depended on whether or not you were worth a pile of cash. Look at one of the most famous battles, Agincourt, 1415. This is the medieval version of a mud wrestling disaster. English knights, outnumbered and surrounded, slogged through knee-deep filth, while arrows rained down and French nobles tripped over their own armor. Forget the idea of heroic duels. Most deaths came from drowning in mud, suffocating under pileups, or being crushed by a panicking horse. The records are clear. Most knights died in the mud, not in glorious duels. If your name was important, or you looked rich enough to sell back to your family, you had a much better chance of making it through the day. Regular soldiers got a sword to the back, no questions asked. It wasn't just accidents, either. The so-called rules of chivalry got tossed out fast if things got ugly. Take King Henry V at Agincourt again. He had a big batch of French prisoners, most taken for ransom. But when it looked like the tide could turn, he ordered them killed to keep the English safe. No dramatic speeches, no second chances, just a brutal calculation. Survival came first, chivalry second. If you think this sounds harsh, you're not alone. But the English didn't complain. Everyone knew that the prioritization of survival and strategic advantage over adherence to the code of chivalry was just part of the business. This wasn't a rare case. Across Europe, knights faced the same ugly reality every time battles started. The bigger and more expensive the armies got, the less knights could rely on fancy rules or individual honor. As the size of armies grew, knights became vulnerable to archers and trained infantry despite their armor. You could be the best fighter in your county and still get picked off by a dozen bowmen or knocked out by a kid with a hammer. Chivalry might have promised fair play, but on a real battlefield, you'd be lucky to find your own horse in the chaos. Never mind arranging a fair fight with your biggest rival. What about that ransom business? That's Hollywood's favorite soft spot. Knights sparing each other's lives out of professional respect. Sure, there were rules if you caught someone important, but even then, if you weren't worth a ransom, you were in trouble. For anyone who didn't wear fancy armor or carry a well-known flag, a quick ending was likely the only thing on offer. Knights looked out for their profits as much as their honor. Medieval combat wasn't about glory or nice stories. It was about grabbing what you could, staying alive, and maybe making enough money in ransoms or loot to rebuild your castle, assuming you had one to go back to. If you line up a movie duel, clean armor, clever swordplay, and breathless chatter with a real melee, the difference jumps out at you. Medieval artwork shows piles of people, horses colliding, men hacking desperately, and nothing elegant about it. If you ever watch a modern reenactment, you'll see how quickly a group fight turns into a tangle of bodies and flying fists. Dramatic duels may be fun to watch, but the battlefield had no room for movie-style heroics. The real winner was the survivor, not the fair fighter. No one got a medal for pausing to bow or letting their enemy go because it was honorable. The code of chivalry handed knights a shiny story to tell at feasts, but when it came to fighting, they played to win. Bravery counted for something, but not as much as being quick, ruthless, and lucky. What knights actually did says a lot more about the nature of their world than the stories we like to hear. But this messy, unfair fight raises another big question. Who, exactly, were these knights represented on the battlefield? Were they really nothing but shining, noble heroes from famous families? Let's clear that up next. So, let's talk about where knights came from. And it's probably not where you think. Hollywood would have you believe every knight lived in a castle the size of a school, ate roast boar for breakfast, and had a shiny gold ring with his family crest stamped on top. The movies line them up as some kind of medieval superhero club, each one richer and more noble than the next. But the truth, the social backgrounds of knights were diverse. Noble blood gave you a head start, but it was never a free ticket to a life of fancy halls and perfect armor. The road to knighthood started long before anyone was old enough to wear armor. Boys from the right families were sent away young, shuttled off to somebody else's castle to begin as a page. Being a page was the medieval version of being a gopher. Run errands, fetch firewood, help clean, and try not to make too many mistakes in front of your boss. No one tells that story in a 3-hour movie. If you survived page duty without dropping too many plates, you became a squire. That was a little more exciting, but it still meant doing all the chores nobody else wanted to do. Squires learned how to polish armor until it shone, saddle horses, and, eventually, how to handle a sword without embarrassing themselves. They were also expected to serve knights on campaign, which meant you might be up before dawn, hauling water, carrying armor, and sleeping in cold tents or on straw, not on any feather mattress. After years of dirty work and hard training, a squire might be knighted, but there were no guarantees. Some washed out, some ran out of money, and others just never got their shot, because their lord didn't think they were good enough. This process is often skipped over in stories, but it's important. You had to prove yourself, not just be born with the right family name. Skill, service, and even luck could pave the way to knighthood. And let's clear up the biggest Hollywood mix-up. Not every knight was loaded. The economic diversity of knighthood meant that not all knights enjoyed a life of luxury. If you didn't inherit land or marry someone with cash, you might scrape by as a minor landowner or poor cousin. Some knights ended up running little patches of farmland, doing whatever they could to get through winter. The cost of being a knight was enormous: armor, weapons, decent horses. It all cost more than most families earned in years. If you wanted to eat, you needed side jobs. There were knights who worked as professional soldiers, basically renting out their sword arms to anyone who could pay their price. They fought for pay, not for pride or a family crest, and there was nothing fancy or noble about that life. Being a knight was a job, not a title, no luxury, just hard work and risk. Some knights were born so far down the social ladder, it was a miracle they got there at all. There are stories of men like William Marshall, one of England's greatest knights, who started as a younger son with almost nothing to his name. He didn't have the money to buy shiny armor or fine horses at first. Instead, he built his reputation on tournaments, which were sometimes closer to organized brawls than proper contests. You could win a little cash, even capture a competitor for ransom, if things went your way. But you could also lose your horse, armor, and dignity in front of 1,000 people. And if luck wasn't on your side, you could go home poorer than when you arrived. On the other end, knights could lose everything, too. War, debt, bad luck. A few wrong turns, and you'd be left with an empty coin pouch and a mountain of trouble. For every knight, with a grand title, there was another dodging tax collectors or begging for a new patron to take them in. The world of knights was a mixed bag, some rich, some poor, all trying to survive in a brutal system. Of course, there were exceptions, the lucky few. Some had huge estates or fancy tapestries, but the movies are obsessed with showing only those guys. It's as if a film about modern police officers showed only billionaires in uniforms. The reality was way more complicated and, honestly, a lot less comfortable. And the code of chivalry? The rules that supposedly turned every knight into a perfect gentleman? The code of chivalry was really for the elite, but many knights broke the rules or ignored them. Fancy words on a scroll meant very little if you were hungry or desperate. When survival was on the line, when money was tight or enemies close, principles tended to fly out the nearest window. At the end of the day, knighthood was never a one-size-fits-all label for the rich and powerful. Some did live in castles, but many just scraped by. Knights were a class that included ambitious newcomers, down-on-their-luck veterans, and everything in between. The Hollywood version cuts out the mess and serves up the fairy tale. But if you looked in a real medieval hall, you'd find a collection of hard-working survivors, each just hoping to make it to the next feast without losing everything. That brings up the next big question. If the life was so rough, why was anyone in a hurry to get the title at all? Let's pull back the curtain on what actually drove men to become knights in the first place. Why would anyone sign up for this wild, muddy life? Hollywood claims knights lived for honor or God, or maybe the pretty face in the tower window. But when you shrug off the fantasy and look at what knights actually had to deal with, the real answer turns out to be a lot more complicated, and honestly a lot more human. Take all that talk about glory. Sure, a few knights wanted their names sung by bards, but most just wanted to pay the bills. Knights had to cough up small fortunes for armor, weapons, and a half-decent horse. The financial burden of being a knight often drove them to seek profit through warfare. This meant there was more money in war than in peace. So you'd find knights chasing after loot, ransoming captured prisoners, and raiding villages, not for medals or epic love stories, but for survival. Being a knight was expensive, and not everyone had a rich uncle or a patch of land to fall back on. If you got the chance to grab some spoils after a siege, you took it. It wasn't pretty, but it kept food on the table, and squires paid. Now about those holy wars you see in every big-budget film. The Crusades get dressed up in stories about brave men fighting in the name of faith, but dig through any medieval account and you'll spot something else. Knights headed to the Holy Land for the same reasons they went anywhere. The Crusades were framed in religious terms, but they were also about opportunity and power. Knights who participated in the Crusades could gain land, wealth, and prestige, making the holy wars a means of personal advancement. It was the medieval version of a business trip. Sure, the Pope told everyone's salvation was on the line, but for lots of knights, what really mattered was a shot at fresh territory, hard cash, and maybe a new title to slap on their name. If fighting for God just happened to come with a side of riches, all the better. Local feuds and politics were also huge drivers. Knights didn't need a grand cause to go to war. Sometimes they rode off to support their lord in a family grudge, or just because a neighboring baron got too mouthy at the last festival. Earning a reputation for toughness, or just being the last guy standing, could turn a nobody into a somebody. Even boredom played a part. Local conflicts provided opportunities for knights to gain land, power, and recognition. If times were slow, unrest was brewing, and nothing exciting was happening on your estate, you could always find another cause, sign up for a campaign, or offer your services to whoever needed a strong sword arm. You might think the code of chivalry gave knights a reason to fight right and fair, but life didn't follow the script. The code sounds nice, but in practice, it was more of a suggestion. The code of chivalry, while promoting honor and ethical behavior, often clashed with the realities of warfare. When knights ended up on the battlefield, the pursuit of wealth and power could lead knights to commit acts that contradicted the code, such as slaughtering innocents or committing sexual offenses. Not exactly what the poetry promised. Mercy had its price. If someone was worth a king's ransom, they might live through the battle. Otherwise, mercy was pretty thin on the ground. The code itself sometimes made things worse when it came to winning. The emphasis on fair fighting, a key tenet of chivalry, could make knights less effective in battle. In theory, it said that a knight couldn't chase down another knight who'd already lost. Captured, you'd be held for ransom instead of being finished off. It might sound honorable, but on the battlefield, hesitation and mercy got you killed, especially when the decline of knights was influenced by the rise of new military tactics and weaponry. The rise of the English longbow, and later, guns meant that all the honor in the world wouldn't stop you from being shot before you even drew your sword. Playing fair also meant knights lost ground to new armies and new weapons. Some knights flipped sides for better pay, or chased after any cause that offered a promotion or chance at something more. Records are full of knights who fought for glory one month and for somebody else's gold the next. It wasn't noble, and it certainly wasn't always loyal, but that was the landscape they lived in. The myth that every knight fought for some higher calling is just that, a myth. So, as much as the stories say knights were paragons of virtue or brave heroes standing up for what's right, the grit and grind of reality show something else. Knights were driven by the same things as most people: ambition, survival, and sometimes just following orders. The myth of the noble crusader is just that, a myth. Strip away the armor, throw out the verse, and you'll find people looking to get ahead, just like everyone else, but with a lot more dirt under their nails and risk in every step. And knowing what motivated these men changes how we look at the whole era. The glossy legends were never the full story, or even close. With that in mind, what do all these myths say about how we picture the Middle Ages today? So, the real code of chivalry wasn't about romance, poetry, or dramatic rescues. It was just an agreement to manage a rowdy gang of wealthy horsemen. The stories you hear about noble quests and perfect manners come from later writers, not the people actually living the life. Movies still love to show knights as heroes, but this romanticized view is a modern invention, not the historical reality. Next time you see chainmail shining in a movie, remember how much messier and unpredictable the real Middle Ages were. There's always another myth ready to crumble, so stick around for more.